again, you've met his wife, you know everything about him. It is my great honor to give you Erik Antonsen.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for being here. We really appreciate it. This is the first time we're trying to do this. And I think at this point in history, there are significant changes that are happening that are really driving the need to do this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But what you've seen so far, I think, is really about trying to start painting a picture of some of the disparate pieces in this community and ecosystem that actually may not at first blush appear to fit together, but when you start looking them through the lens of human spaceflight, all of these things start tying together. And it's one of the reasons why I came back to Boston was because I did go down to Houston and spend a bunch of time there working at NASA and saw the way things worked, and I felt like it wasn't a place. NASA is an amazing institution. There's good and bad things about every institution we work at. But I also felt like the ecosystem and the intellectual capacity, the institutions, the things that are here in Boston were a more fertile territory for ideas and ways to put together those ideas with some of the things that we've known in the past than where I was at. So I was recruited back here because of all of these different strengths that the Boston community has. And as a part of that, one of the things that I'm going to just talk about today is the training ecosystem a little bit. So we have amazing scientists and amazing doctors and amazing engineers and all of these things here in Boston. How do they get to be amazing? They go through training programs. Training programs where we learn from each other. Training programs where we learn on the job. And so the pipeline for how we train people, not just here in Boston, but everywhere, is a mishmash of different things that we have seen historically are kind of stepping stones to different jobs that we do. Many of them complement each other. And so in Boston here, and I'm just going to focus on our institutions that are a part of this conference for the moment, obviously we have amazing undergraduate institutions for training folks. And besides the two that I mentioned there's probably like another 70 out there in this area. This has been a hub for learning for a long time. Graduate schools as well. These ones are not bad. Medical schools. Specific programs that try to take those things and tie them together, like the Health Sciences and Technology program that is a merger between MIT and Harvard that trains PhDs, MD PhDs to be those translational scientists. We train our clinicians through residency programs. MGB is Mass General Brigham, which is the rebranded name of what was Partners, which was Mass General, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and all the other things. I don't know, they decided to change it, and we're supposed to call it all MGB now. But as you all know, I did my residency up here, 4-year emergency medicine residency here at Harvard and Mass General, and it was one of the best learning experiences of my life. And then there's fellowships, right? If you get done with your residency and you're looking to go further in training, there is that professional training and guidance to take you to the next level because of the level of world-class expertise that is here. And even beyond that, as a young or a mid-career faculty in these places, there are programs like IMES, the Institute for Medical and Engineering Sciences. Did I get that right? Medicine and Engineering Science? Okay. Which is something that is really sort of a very unique program that has made a home for those translational sciences, MD, PhDs in those groups, who are really pushing the boundaries of what we know in human disease and human health, in biotechnology, across the spectrum. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the fellowship part of this picture, because I think that in the last few years is something that's unique and probably warrants some explanation. So in 2022, we began both here and at Baylor College of Medicine. It was actually two places, because I was still working at Baylor at the time. The Space Medicine Fellowship that was there. It was a joint venture, and shortly after that, I came back to Boston, and so we've now centralized it here at Mass General. There's a history here and a reason why we did this now, right? Why after 60 years of space flight would you be starting a space medicine training program? Don't we know everything already? Haven't we been flying the ISS for 25 years? with humans always up there. And so I'm going to talk through a little bit of this history. Now, some of it comes back to the terminology, right? Aerospace versus space. When I did my undergraduate degree in engineering, it was aeronautical and astronautical, and those things in many fields overlap. And much of the growth of what we've done has come through learning about both, right? And there is a lot to learn from aviation in the space world, and a lot that we have learned from it. The bulk, one of the things that I just want you to think about, though, is look at the difference that you see between these things, right? Somebody mentioned earlier that we are not flying people in space every day like we do on airlines, right? It is not a mature industry. Rebecca mentioned that it is an experiment every time we fly somebody in space. We are early in the space industry, despite the fact that we've been doing it for 60 to 70 years. In that picture, right, that aircraft there, I can tell you that in China, in 2016 alone, there were 1 billion people who got on airplanes that looked like that. And contrast that with what Todd told us earlier, that there were 670 people of our entire species who have ever gone to space, right? So I want you to just, and that was China in 1 year, right? 1 billion people. 670 people. There is a massive difference in what we understand and know about human spaceflight, and we are still learning as we go. On the other hand, in the aviation industry, we have a set of standards that have been derived from years and years of data that tell us what's safe and what's not. And we've seen it in the success of the industry. So I'm drawing a distinction between this because the medical specialty has lived in aerospace medicine for a very long time. And it is a very important medical specialty, and there's a lot of things it's got to do, but there is also room now for areas where these two places diverge. There is no aviation analog for somebody spending 6 months on a space station. There is no aviation analog for somebody walking on the moon in 1.6G. So our analog breaks down at some point, and there is room within the industry for people who are focusing on the space side of this. In 2001, NASA was just starting to field the ISS, and they went to the Institutes of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health, the National Academies of Medicine, and they asked for help figuring out how they should think about space medicine going into the future. And there was an amazing book called Safe Passage that was written then, looking forward to the ISS and beyond at that time. And their conclusion, which I love quoting, is shown here, right? This is going to change as our capabilities in space travel change. This is going to change as our medicine changes and we learn more. And so those changes must continually be kept in the mind as all of these things evolve. And so what I'm arguing right now is that now is time for one of those evolutions. Interestingly, the first department of space medicine in the United States was formed in 1949 in the US Air Force, because they were looking to human spaceflight, looking ahead to something that still wouldn't happen for another 11 years. But they saw that this is the direction that this is going, this is where the funding's at. We are going to prepare for this because we haven't done it before. We need to learn about what the human is going to experience and how they tolerate that. So the actual first department of space medicine was one that was not clinically oriented, but research oriented and trying to help us to understand. Over the years, there was a variety of efforts that kind of started merging the aviation world, especially from the military, together with spaceflight. And in 1993, the first dedicated training program that NASA funded was created at UTMB, University of Texas Medical Branch. And that program functions today. In the first 4 years of its existence, it was a fellowship program, training professionals who had already done their residency training. And then in 1997, that changed. It became a residency. It went, to my sense, a little bit backwards, right? Why would you go from, you've got this advanced professional training to a residency? And the reason why was because they were looking for certification, board certification, and that existed at the American Board of Preventive Medicine. And they had a rule that said you can't get certified if you don't do a qualifying residency. And so they just made it a residency. So now, board certification is something that's supposed to standardize training, but now we've got programs in aviation, a whole bunch of them, and we got a program in space medicine, and they're training very different things. They're not standardized. And so what we looked at was, throughout the 25 years of the ISS and the things that we've been doing, this model has worked. It has worked well enough, but things are changing. And even at that time, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not aerospace medicine and space medicine should start having capabilities in both domains. And so Bernard Harris, who you see here, Pat McGinnis, friends, Bernard was a physician astronaut. This was some of the discussion they had even before the space station. Should we be subspecializing? And so in 2022, after and sort of during the beginning of this renaissance in commercial spaceflight, we formed the MGB SpearMed division here. We formed a fellowship that started here. As Stuart mentioned, the first GME-approved fellowship in the country that is bearing the name space medicine, that is focusing on the spaceflight part. De-emphasizing but not removing all of the aviation, right? Because there is a lot to learn there. And we weren't alone. There were 2 other programs that started at the same time. UCLA has a program, University of Texas has a program. These groups, we may be our competitors, but we are also friends, and we all work together to create a Space Medicine Fellowship Council that is now approved the core content for the subspecialty, is working towards aligned curriculum and working towards an eventual board development. So starting to build out, hey, it's really important that looking forward in this industry, we have people who are focusing on the space aspects of this primarily. And moving beyond the preventive medicine domain, which is, I'd say, rather mature in the way that they function till now and doing an amazing job, to what are the areas that need more attention. Why is this? So Stuart mentioned before the cost of spaceflight is dropping. And I love this graphic. It came out a couple of years ago, but it really starts to show how the SpaceX model has actually dropped the costs. So when I was an aerospace engineering grad student, right, it was just gospel that everything that went to space was $10,000 a kilogram. And it was really an average of all those things up until like the 2000s. And then SpaceX started working their model, the reusability of rockets, things that when I was a grad student in propulsion, we all thought, oh, this is impossible. And of course, today, it's very possible, right? And so you start to see that fall in cost. So that 2 orders of magnitude that we're talking about, there are some folks who estimate as low as $200, maybe as low as $10 per kilogram to orbit. We have seen 10 iterations of the Starship rocket now. It is getting there. And despite the media sort of saying, oh, the rocket blows up, it has met all of its testing requirements through this campaign. So don't listen to the media on this one, okay? Why does this matter? Because we are now building out different things, right? The low Earth orbit economy we are attempting to build out. Artemis missions are attempting to go back to the moon with 2 major commercial companies working to supply human landing systems, right? And for Mars, we have a Moon to Mars program office at NASA that is trying to make sure that we use the moon as the testing ground to make us successful in the mission to Mars, to burn down that risk, right? But the other thing that you see here is that our experience base and the things we know drops off significantly, right? So this isn't, some dichotomy between applied research in order to just go do one thing. We have to learn and understand things along the way. We have to learn from all these experiences because it's been so rare. And so a part of this is recognizing that we are now moving into that domain where the government support is changing, the commercial industry is stepping in, and who is flying is changing significantly. So if we look just at low Earth orbit as a destination, what's coming down the road in commercial spaceflight? Like the ISS is flying, Tiangong is flying, Axiom, Orbital Reef. There's a whole bunch of different groups that are competing to try to be the replacement for the International Space Station in a commercial vision, not a fully government vision. It's more like the government, at least up until now, wants to be the anchor tenant, like the Macy's and the mall, right, for this, and have other department stores or other stores and processes going on in low Earth orbit. And the amount of work that's going on here is just, let me just say, it's vast. You're welcome, Dana. So that's one of our goals. Our other goal is to go farther, right? And what happens when you go farther? You lose these advantages of what we've been living off of in low Earth orbit for the last 25 years, right? And these are major advantages. Real-time communications for support, the ability to evacuate somebody who's sick, a relatively strong consumables reply chain. You go to the moon, now it's 3 to 11 days, potentially, to get somebody back, depending on how you designed your system and how much fuel you brought, right? You go to Mars, and you lose all this stuff. And all of these challenges are happening at a time when astronauts are being deconditioned by being in that environment for a longer time. And it's also a time when we are now having them to increase their autonomy. So they're getting beat down by the environment at the exact moment they got to get better at dealing with it. So our current moment in space now looks like this to me. There are 3 main things that are changing that affect space medicine. The people who fly are changing. It's no longer the highly healthily selected astronaut-only process from NASA and from the USOS and Russia. The things that we're flying them on, those vehicles are new. The habitats, new. Spacesuits, new. Things break when they're new. You have problems when they're new. You're learning about the operational envelopes when they're new. So that changes your risk profile from an injury perspective. And the missions are changing, right? We're not just going to the ISS anymore. We are potentially asking people to go and do construction in a partial gravity environment on the moon for a base, which is a whole different story than, filling a petri dish in low Earth orbit. The injury risk profile is different. So when all these things change, you need to change your medical model. So this was published in Scientific American recently. And what you see here is age over on the left, on the y-axis, and the years that we were flying on the bottom. And what you see is the illustration of this change, right? In 2021, you took who was flying and you just widened out the ages, right? Even though it's suborbital, now you have somebody as young as 18, as old as 92. Guess what? They have very different medical concerns than the people who have been flying for all the years before them. This is in press over at NPJ Microgravity, some demographics report looking at who's been flying in the commercial spaceflight industry. Their categorization process, some professional astronauts, a whole pile of celebrities on Blue Origin. That's a different demographic. Veteran adventurers, science tourists, young adventurers, these are not categories we've seen before, right? They're doing it for different reasons. The job is changing. The people are changing. This is the companies that are flying them. For a very long time, it was just government. And now you start to see around 2021 this explosion of commercial activity. Right? So this is not a passing fad at this point. So when we recognized that moment, we said we need to change how we're doing business. Right? We need to build on the good things we've learned from, and we've got some mature models, but we need new things. So we created these new fellowship programs in 2022. What happens? Anybody who's going to go into these domains has got to do 4 years of medical school, then they got to do 3 to 7 years of a primary residency, then they'll do 2 years of a fellowship, and then they really start to learn, as many doctors do, on the job, right? Which is partly what residency and fellowship are. So the pathway that's already in existence has been a 2-year pathway after a primary residency, or there are joint. There's an aerospace medicine IM and an aerospace medicine emergency medicine one now. The pathway that we created was 2 years, and we highlighted different things. We created core content across that is now combined across all the new fellowship programs, and are working with anybody who's looking at creating a new fellowship program to go through the same things. But one of the most important things that we think is critical is maintenance of your clinical skills. That's our first fellow, Dr. Apiza, up on somewhere in the Himalayas repairing a yak herder who got the bad end of the yak's horn. Is that right? We send them to remote areas to work as the physicians themselves without the backup, right? To get comfortable with these domains. Kotzebue, Alaska, other places like that, in addition to the rotations at some of the companies like SpaceX, VAST, other places that we are, where they have things to learn. And it's not just about clinical medicine, it is also about being able to interface with companies who are designing the systems and designing the vehicles and the suits and all those sort of things at the earliest portions of the systems engineering process. Because in the past, that's a very large part of what has been missing, is the ongoing and persistent interaction between physicians or the medical community and the earliest parts of the design processes. You don't actually get things designed into your vehicle if you don't show up until like the third quarter. The future is going to look different. This is from a textbook that Jennifer Mindock from EXMC, other folks here will recognize, talking about the crew health and performance system for a lunar base. And it's the same for the vehicles, right? It has to interface with all of these different things on the spacecraft. You have to understand what your environment is. If you're going to do research, you need to be able to move the data around. Thermal, exercise, all these different things have to talk to each other here, which is very different from in a hospital where we practice. When we practice in a hospital, you got the oxygen on the wall and you turn it on and you never give a thought to where the hell it came from, right? In space, you have to. And so our doctors need to be given additional information, additional background on where does that come from? What are the limits of these things? Why shouldn't you push that red button? So the key to this is that the systems for tomorrow's spaceflight are being designed today. They are being designed at SpaceX. They are being designed at VAST. They're being designed at Blue Origin. All of these places, right? The role that NASA plays has been to transfer information, to support them, to help them, right? And in many cases, funding them. But the relationship is changing over time. And how we design the systems going forward are going to determine how well we learn along the way those things that we need to learn about our own physiology, about how we do this in a least risky profile that we can, right? The research that gets done now by SpaceX and VAST and these other companies is what sets the stage for our ability to actually go to Mars, but only if we actually are attentive to it and design it into the systems. If you don't design in the sensor, you don't get the data feedback. And that's one of the challenges we ran into for years at NASA when we were working on the medical side of things, was that the ISS had been frozen in design so long before that it was really hard to put things in after the fact. But ISS was huge and had a lot of up-mass capability, right? And so when we get to that point where we do go to Mars, what happens when you take away mission control? Because it's a 45-minute round trip from the furthest point for communications between when Earth and Mars are on the other side of the sun. Actually, we're on the opposite side of the sun. It's a 2-week blackout window, unless you've got a relay satellite, right? But it's like 45 minutes to say hi and get a message back. And every day on the ISS, you've got this gigantic room of support with all these years of experience and all of these degrees in engineering and all that stuff, and more people you can call on and turn on. And guess what you got when you're going to Mars? You got you and whatever the hell you made out of your AI project to figure out how to fix everything that goes wrong. So here's the deep, dirty secret about ISS. Rebecca mentioned earlier on that I didn't put the slide in here, but in the 20-year lifetime from 1990, 2000 until 2020 was we looked at the data. There were 1.7 events per year that would have killed the crew if they didn't have all of these people immediately available in the first hour of an adverse situation. In the first 6 years of ISS, remember we said that new things break? That number is actually 3 to 4 times a year. Mars missions may take as long as 3 years. So it isn't just about can you keep them healthy, it's about can you keep them healthy and performing well enough and augment them enough to be able to fix all the things that are going to break on the way there, because as Dr. Rockless pointed out earlier, there's a lot of things we can't predict and we don't design correctly in, and you learn it on the job after the fact. So as we think about these exploration systems, right, we have to be tying these systems together in a meaningful way. The human systems, we need the observational data. The environmental systems, we need that habitation data. We need to manage the data. We need to be able to communicate with the data, right? Medicine is actually a very data-intensive process, right? We're gathering all this information, try to figure out what to do with it. Why do we do this? Because one characterizes the crew operational state, one characterizes the environmental operational state, and when you throw it all together, you actually have a shot at figuring out why is that guy gasping for air over there and complaining of a headache, right? Because if you're starting at 0 all the time and you don't have that group of mission control, you're screwed. So as we look ahead, right, human spaceflight and space medicine are in a time of rapid change. And the training pathways that we are building need to respond to that change. We need to have in place the strong systems we've put before, but we need to complement them with the upgrades that are needed to address these new changes. And so I hope I've convinced you that this moment is where those changes are happening, and that it's really important for us to start building the leaders out today through that entire training pathway who are going to take us through the next 2 decades of exploration and the development of low Earth orbit. And so this, at MGB, our Space Medicine Fellowship, is one part of this ecosystem. And for anybody who's interested, we're starting to accept applications next week for next year. And one other thing I want to mention is it wasn't just us. We are supporters of, and we work with a group called OSMED, the Organization for Space Medicine Engineering Design, which is a organization, a nonprofit, that has really only been around for a little bit over a year, but it is a group that said, hey, our professional societies are really only advancing their own professions. We want to form a place where it makes sense to bring together complementary professions and professionals who can work on the problems of human spaceflight, not just the engineers, the doctors, the designers, the life scientists, but really trying to figure out how do we have those interdisciplinary discussions. And I think today, if any of you listened to Dr. Mutha's talk, right, starting to see the wheels turn among him and other scientists by bringing these different ideas together is something that we're all shooting for. And so if you're interested, you can find more information on this at osmed.org. And I will stop there and thank you for your attention. Do we have time?
We certainly do.
Okay, I guess I'm entertaining a question. If there are any questions. Hi.
I'll project, I guess. So this relates back to some of the panel discussion that we had earlier, and thinking a little bit about the shape and nature of, let's say, privacy of information and the way that we are using the information that we gather about astronauts and crew. I really don't want to talk into this. Hopefully that's okay. If there's a role for instrumentation going forward, what do you think that looks like, particularly in the conversation that we need to have with, I guess, our participants, our astronaut crew, whomever it is that's flying, and our folks on the medicine side or on our operations side, as we start thinking about wanting to gather more of that information, wanting to increase the swap of those individual pieces of technology and integrate it overall into our spacesuits, into our habitats, into our X, Y, and Z spacecraft, everything. What do you envision here as the role of instrumentation?
This is a great question because it's something we struggled with at NASA a lot. So coming out of the 60s and 70s, our astronauts gained this aura of national hero, right? And they took amazing risks, and they were doing amazing things, and they still are, right? But what it ended up informing throughout the lifetime of NASA so far is this a culture that so fiercely guards the information that I've come to interpret it more as gatekeeping than as actual protection of information, okay? So protected health information is a super important topic, right? The astronauts are not subject to HIPAA because NASA's not a healthcare organization. They're subject to the 1974 Privacy Act. The information that's held inside of NASA is a gold mine for people who are trying to figure out how do we actually design the sensors and what do we want to look for, right? How has the physiology changed? How have their bodies changed over time? We have the lifetime surveillance of astronaut health, right? So we've collected all these things. We even have a biorepository that Dr. McGonigal, a pathologist over at JSC, sees, watches over like a hawk and nobody can get anything out of it. And not for lack of trying. She actually wants it to be set up as a full repository that is like a biorepository anyplace else with the appropriate governance, right? And so the question that you're really asking is a question of information governance. And it's a question that every data information system, hospitals have been dealing with this for a long time, right? You're not supposed to give away patient information to anybody, but in appropriate cases they can use it. So one of the things that happened inside NASA is that they struggled with the idea of de-identification, right? We would love to get the information out. It's kind of hard if you say this person was a 44-year-old female who flew in 1983 and, not make it obvious that this was so-and-so. Right? Like, that's a tough thing. So they have a challenging problem, right? Today, however, we have a variety of things that can be brought to bear. And by the way, for a number of years, there is actually a board at NASA called the AOHMG, which sets the level at which de-identification is termed by NASA to occur. It's if you have at least 5 individuals in the group. And then when requests come into them for data, they turn them down regularly because they're scared, right? Even though there's a policy in there that says if you have at least 5 and you take out key information, right, you can share that. So really what you're talking about is a culture where we've been trying to protect all this data and it's appropriate, but now you have things that can be done, right? Synthetic data and different ways of actually managing data to create things that are completely de-identified are all within reach, but NASA's not a data organization, right? It's not a Google. So if we can get that information more appropriately governed, it can be made available to people in a non-threatening way.
Well, I think my question actually is more geared towards the instrumentation side of things. So if we're thinking about some of the struggles that we see with data governance, how do we then use that to inform the way that we integrate or advance the ways that we're collecting data on individuals so that we can get the data that we need in order to, do our jobs or to help inform, let's say, cognitive states or, whatever those states are that we care about.
Yeah. First of all, you got to get the things up there, right? That is actually one of the biggest problems that we've had. I spent years at EXMC trying to get an X-ray up onto the space station to do a technology demonstration for it. We never got there. You know who did? Fram 2 in the private mission. They didn't have to jump through all these barriers that honestly, do you think that if you're going to be willing to get an X-ray on Earth, do you think it's really going to be that much more dangerous to you to do an X-ray in the vehicle? Like one? So, we also couldn't get the butterfly ultrasound up on the space station because the batteries were not appropriate from the NASA's fire safety limits. So what happened? SpaceX took it up.
And it lives on the ISS still.
And it's still on the ISS. And then there's the ownership aspect of it. So there was an amazing experiment with Spaceborne Computer that took the MinION and swabbed a surface, and they then did PCR in this instrument, and they moved all the calculations onto the supercomputer, the Spaceborne Computer that was up on the space station, and they took the turnaround time for the information it would have taken to tell what that species was from 6 months, because that would have had to be sent to the ground and out to a lab and everything, down to 11 seconds, right? Amazing. The Translational Research Institute for Space Health then asked, can we do this with some human genomic stuff? And you know what the actual roadblock was? It was that the Human Research Program had only decided they were going to support the instrument for this long for that research project, and the ISS didn't pick it up, so nobody was willing to be responsible for the operation of the instrument, so we have a floating dead piece of instrument up there that could do amazing science. Right? So getting things up there and getting things that make sense in terms of using these technologies, these sensors and capabilities is one of those things that when you have a hardened bureaucracy just becomes super difficult, right? Commercial spaceflight is doing it differently, and we need to enable that, right? Obviously, everybody's going to have different risk tolerances, right? Where's the right level? But we're at the stage where we're talking about where those regulations should live, and trying to figure out what the right set of regulations are is something we all need to be involved with. So that set of information, right, that series of sensors that picks up that information, you design in the sensors, you design in the data streams. NASA as a customer, or SpaceX or somebody else, they have to be the ones who own the system that puts that information in, processes it, and then makes use of it, right? You can't have what has been a model of our industry for a very long time, so-and-so's favorite blood monitor, and say, let's fly this, it'll solve all our problems, right? You actually have to figure out, from a systems perspective, how those things get integrated and inform the things that actually matter about physiology, and that's where we've struggled. So we can talk more about it offline, but some examples. All right.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Oh. Thanks.